Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Today's episode is based on an essay I wrote called If You Really Want to Know the Truth, Dark Passengers on The Catcher in the Rye. You can link to that essay in the description and you can read it in full on Substack. I begin the essay by talking about the fact that this was the first novel that I ever read. This was in high school. I didn't read much at all previous to high school. I thought there were better things to be doing, better things to do outside and musically. And even though I partly regret that, I think in hindsight, there is a lot to recommend by that approach. And actually, I would say if you're young and you're getting a lot of books thrown at you, especially today, a lot of very uninteresting books, get outside. Maybe you can get to the books later, okay? Get outside, move the body around. That's my medical advice for you. So I've always had a complicated relationship with this novel because I see the shortcomings in it, but I'm attracted to the power of its prose. This novel has also had a complicated political history. It was an obsession for a number of high-profile assassins. Mark David Chapman, who assassinated John Lennon, was obsessed with this novel. So was John Hinckley, who tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan. Some people speculate that this novel was part of the CIA's MK Ultra program, and it was used as a triggering device. I don't know much about that. I do find it interesting. I think that's something to think about, but I think you can really just look at the novel and find everything you need to find about the violence that it could inspire. This wouldn't be the first time the government has dabbled in literature. John Steinbeck's The Moon is Down, which gets its title from Macbeth. I also think Macbeth has some influence on this novel, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. That novel was clearly a work of propaganda, deliberately trying to get people, raise morale, get people interested in the war, and tried to win the war. So I begin, after all that, I begin with a description of the plot. I say here, the novel's plot is deceptively simple, though crowded. A boy from the power layer of society flunks out of yet another private school just before Christmas, a time of rebirth through trials, and goes on a bender in nearby New York City. So in this way, this novel is also a campus novel. It's partly about private schools. There's a tradition of novels like this. One, I think, really interesting one that comes to my mind is Robert Musil's The Confessions of Young Torless. And as I said, this novel has had kind of a complex effect on me because in a lot of ways, my first novel, Non-Local, was inspired by this novel in as I said, the power of the prose and trying to write a Bildungsroman that tries to capture childhood or adolescence in the kind of that wild period of life. So this novel does that well. So does Robert Musil's, and I think there are others. I'll continue. He sees several adult perverts, dances with empty-headed female tourists from the Midwest, gets swindled and roughed up by a teen prostitute and her pimp, flees a potential homosexual advance from an ex-teacher, and plans a westward escape that's thwarted by the only person who shows him love, his younger sister. All these events present a psychological breakdown that leads to maturity, a 20th century Bildungsroman. So you can hear by this description of the plot of the novel that it is Odysseus-like, the Odyssey, right? We have a lone character who's going through a number of adventures and trying to get back home. In the sense, he does end up back home, but he is transformed through that experience. A lot is talked about in this novel about Holden Caulfield, the main character's interest in childhood innocence and wanting to preserve that innocence. I think a helpful way to think about this is William Blake's what he called Contraries, so the Innocence and Experience, which is actually the name of the collection he gives that tries to capture these two sides of the human experience. So it's not that we're just moving from innocence to experience, but that we have both these when we're trying to wrestle with these throughout our life. These are two sides of our experience, two sides of our life. And I've written here, the significance of Allie. So this is the character who's not actually in the book as a character, but he's in there as a memory. This is Holden's brother who dies before the novel starts and really has a big impact on a lot of the action throughout this novel, and is kind of this is the character that people reach for when they're thinking of the childhood innocence. This is kind of the model that Holden has for innocence. So what I say about this, the significance of Allie and his death is more than representational. So I don't think he's only representing childhood innocence. Like Kafka's The Metamorphosis and even Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which is referenced in The Catcher in the Rye in both name and homage. So the end of the novel, he speaks about the novel directly. Holden likes the novel. Also, at the end, there's the scene when Holden is trying to erase the "fuck you" written on the staircase. This is taken directly from The Great Gatsby. So like those novels, our protagonist, Holden, is confronting his double. Holden sees himself in Allie. So I think the metamorphosis, Gregor is seeing himself, like the insect is his double. This is other side of him. And I think the same thing is true for Nick Carraway in Jay Gatsby. So Holden is seeing himself in Allie. That's his double. This is the symbolic meaning of the red hunting hat. It's a prosthetic for Allie's hair, a redness you can feel. The wearing of the hat is a reconciling of the Blakean contrary already referenced, and that contrary goes some way in explaining Holden's confusion. So when he puts this hat on, he's kind of trying to wrestle with these two experiences of innocence and experience, these two sides. And this is a lot of where a lot of the confusion comes from and the trouble and the problems for Holden. I actually compare this in here to Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio when Pinocchio puts the yellow wig on, his Geppetto's yellow wig, and really sets the theme for the rest of that novel. I'll continue on. Holden, however, associates the recognition of his double with violence. Recall, he describes the red hat as a people-hunting hat for a novel that contains little actual violence. There's not much violence in this novel. Holden gets punched twice, that's it. There is an abundance of imagined and implied violence. The mental return to childhood innocence, which is initiated in the novel through Allie's baseball mitt, seems to provoke anger, madness, an appetite for destruction. So for Holden, the reconciling of innocence and this adult experience that he's merging into causes a kind of an explosion of violence. But again, it's not actual violence. It's all either imagined or alluded to. And I think the reason why this is on one hand, innocence has died, right? Allie is that innocence, and he has died. Holden had his own, and that is also past. But the world continues on. And to go back to Blake, this is what Blake called the fallen world. This is the experience that we have in everyday life. And for Blake, we needed to use poetry to get to that innocence. Holden doesn't seem to have a solution. He just kind of rants and rages against this fallen state. As I write here, in Blakean terms, this continuation, so life after innocence, is the fallen world. In Salinger's terms, through Holden, it's the phony moronic. So this is even more talked about or more discussed in the novel than childhood innocence. I think it's the phoniness of the world, the phoniness of adults, how stupid they are, right? He uses the word moron a lot. I'll continue on. I say, the world has fallen from some previous state of good and innocence and idealized potential, if never a reality. And those in this fallen state with varying degrees of awareness of their primordial and mythic goodness respond with affectation, phoniness, and by extension, stupidity. So in the fallen state, how do we deal with that? We deal with this by posing, by affectation, which in itself is stupid, right? If you see through it. And that's really one of Holden's problems. He sees through it. I write again, this repulsive state is American popular culture. So that's what he's railing against, the dominant culture of America in the 1950s, this popular culture. In this way, The Catcher in the Rye also follows the modernist lineage of the novels already mentioned, so Metamorphosis and The Great Gatsby, in being anti-modern and essentially conservative in perspective. And I know this would probably strike many as, what do you mean this is conservative in perspective? It views society as trapped in a fallen state whose day-to-day existence is inauthentic and spiritually corrosive. The only corrective is a return to a previous way of existence. And this is why I think it is conservative in perspective. And I think this is true for many, many great novels. And this is kind of I think a shock, because we assume that the artist is progressive, and he is in many ways. He has to be an artist. But at the same time, he's often repulsed by the modern world and the mainstream life and wants to see a return to some previous way. He sees the present and the future as being worse than the past, and he wants to go back to that past. And that is a conservative perspective. And I think this marrying of the progressive and the conservative is a very interesting thing that we see in art. And I think more needs to be thought about it and written about it. I also think that part of the reason why so many modern novels are so bad is because they're deliberately trying to say that the past wasn't great, and it's the future that we have to construct and look forward to, which in some ways, I think this is it implies that the flaw in us is from the start. And that's, I think, a repulsive view for many. So in The Catcher in the Rye, the moment of innocence being lost, the fall, so to speak, is World War II. This is a post-World War II novel. There's no mention of the war, but it's all there in the background. There's a lot of, as I said, a lot of hints to violence. So what I wrote on this, I say, locating America's fall in World War II unites the novel to Salinger's biography, right? He was in the war. This really affected him. His wartime experience would likely have been a Rubicon severing his life in two halves, just like the biblical fall does, for the understanding of innocence and evil, and the implication that the latter is necessary for experience. And I think this is the difficult message in this novel. The subversive, offensive, and even frightening implications at the core of The Catcher in the Rye, and a drive for censoring it, and many people have tried to censor this novel, is that debauchery and bad behavior, mild evil, are necessary components of positive human growth. So this is what's so outrageous about this novel. It seems to suggest that we need to deviate. We need to dally maybe in debauchery, in sin, in order to have positive human growth. In this way, I think it's not unlike many other novels. And even I'm thinking of maybe St. Augustine's Confessions in that same worldview, that the great sinner becomes the one who grows the most. I don't think Salinger is naive to the fact that World War II was the only fall for America. America itself was founded on, essentially a slaughter of the Native Americans. And I think, again, we can find a hint to this in Allie. Allie dies of leukemia, which is a blood cancer, which I think implies that of some kind of contamination deep down in the blood. This reminds me of Addie Bundren in William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, where she talks about the terrible blood that kind of courses through the land. And she sees that all the characters are kind of inherently bad in some way, or have, even if they're trying to do good, there's some inherent badness in it. And I think this actually brings The Catcher in the Rye closer to the story, the biblical fall. This contamination of adulthood also ties The Catcher in the Rye to Macbeth. So the violence that we don't see in The Catcher in the Rye, we get in Macbeth. And Macbeth is really playing out the corrupt adulthood that Holden is trying to hold off, or to push out, to criticize. And what I say on this part, I say Macbeth shows audiences what it means to play the game, a euphemism that Holden despises, for he knows how unfair the game is and how cruel and potentially murderous it can become. So that phrase, playing the game, is what, at the very beginning of the novel, Holden's teacher, Old Spencer, tells him, you got to play the game, right? You got to play along. And even later, the teacher, Mr. Antonio, who tries to have some kind of sexual relations with Holden, or at least Holden thinks that, and runs off, he also kind of tells him he needs to play the game. So the adult message is, the world's false, and you need to be false, and go along with it. And that's also the message of Macbeth, or at least for Macbeth specifically. Macbeth is playing the game, we can see how bad that can be. And Holden sees that. Macbeth's playing of the game is analogous to World War II. So that's an outcome of playing the game. Holden knows that playing the game successfully is almost wholly dependent on which team you're on. Despite being on the winning team, as Holden is, or at least adjacent to it, he rejects the game. And this is really Holden's core problem. He rejects the game. Out of a moral worldview, some could call childish, because it is maladapted to adult society. So by rejecting the game, this is a childish position. It's just by the sake of, this is what all adults are doing. So it's not well adapted to the adult life. And this is Holden's great problem. And I also think this is why this book leads, or has led to, or has acted as a trigger to violence. Because there are many who have this same perspective, that refuse to play the game, or maybe they're not even allowed to play the game. They've been pushed out. And in this novel, has some sympathy for those types of people, and maybe also gives them some strength, that they're not alone in that, maybe that anger. So wrapping up as my kind of final evaluation on this novel, I say the novel moved me as well. So just as it maybe moved some others in the wrong direction, in a violent direction, it also moved me, and it still does, despite being of obviously less literary greatness than the works it draws from, including certainly Macbeth. In some ways, it has imprinted, like original antigenic sin, a certain template of understanding and creating, and the activities of reading and writing, which I've been trying to shake for 2 decades. Certainly I see in my own writing, Holden's voice pops up now and then. I don't always like it. I wonder if this is the same template Salinger himself wrestled in his hinterlands of New Hampshire. So Salinger retired from public life in Cornish, New Hampshire, and in part, I wonder if that was because he was trying to wrestle with this book that he wrote, and I wonder how much this book might have poisoned or, kind of overshadowed the other work that he might have written afterwards and didn't even publish. Well, those are my thoughts on this novel. I'd like to hear your own, so write them in the description. Thanks for listening.